If it's Wednesday, Russian aggression once again front and center in American politics. From Congress to the campaign trail, as Trump compares his legal troubles to the death of Alexei Navalny, and an FBI informant in the House's impeachment inquiry is found to have ties to Russian intelligence. Plus, abortion and the 2024 race. In an NBC News exclusive, the wife of a Republican running in a highly competitive Senate race opens up about her abortion as her husband says he will not support a federal abortion ban. And President Biden makes a billion-dollar bet on student loan relief as he struggles to win over young voters heading into November. Hello and welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Ryan Nobles in Washington, where the specter of Russia seems to be looming over almost every aspect of American politics, from threats to national security to the chaos on Capitol Hill surrounding aid to Ukraine and the impeachment inquiry into the president. And it all comes as Russian President Vladimir Putin appears to be flexing his power and influence. The White House is warning Americans to leave Russia as we learn more about the latest Russian-American dual national to be detained by Moscow on suspicion of treason for allegedly donating money to support Ukraine. NBC News spoke with her former mother-in-law, who raised concerns about her safety in light of the death of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny.
I'm desperate, to be honest. With the news of last week, with the murder of Alexei Navalny, we all know that she is not safe there. And if we do not help her, so she will spend the rest of her life in jail. If we do not help her as America, as a country that she belongs to now, nobody else will.
Putin's crackdown on dissent in Russia also in the spotlight on the campaign trail here in the U.S. as Donald Trump addressed Navalny's death during a Fox News town hall last night.
Navalny is a very sad situation, and he's very brave. He was a very brave guy because he went back. He could have stayed away. But it's happening in our country, too. We are turning into a communist country in many ways. And if you look at it, I'm the leading candidate. I get indicted. I never heard of being indicted before.
Now, that position by Trump and his unwillingness to condemn Putin comes as his allies in the House are holding up a foreign aid bill that includes more than $60 billion in vital military assistance for Ukraine to fight back against Russia. And today, House Republicans are facing questions about whether or not their impeachment inquiry into President Biden may have been influenced by Russia. According to a filing by federal prosecutors, a former FBI informant who was a central figure in the House's inquiry allegedly provided false information about the president and his son based in part on what he was told by officials associated with Russian intelligence. Congressman Jim Jordan, who of course is one of the lawmakers leading the impeachment inquiry, spoke to reporters today ahead of a closed-door deposition with President Biden's brother.
What do you think of the Smirnoff indictment?
Well, I mean, it is what it is, so it doesn't change the fundamental facts. There are four fundamental facts that Hunter Biden gets put on the board of Burisma. He's not qualified to be on the board. He gets put on that board and gets paid $1 million a year.
You say it doesn't change the facts. It does change the facts. Those are no longer facts. Those are not true.
The four things I just said, they're absolutely true.
That's our Gary Grumbach pressing Jim Jordan. So with no indication that these mounting threats posed by Russia will fade anytime soon, the big question remains, how prepared is the U.S. to address the multifaceted threat? To get us started, NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel is in Ukraine with more.
It's not surprising that the U.S. is calling on all Americans, including dual nationals, American Russian citizens, to leave Russia immediately. It's a sign of how tense things are right now between the United States and European countries and Vladimir Putin's government. This latest woman who was taken off the streets in January, a 33-year-old ballerina, has been arrested for the flimsiest of reasons. She is accused of treason in Russia, which is a serious crime in any country, carries a very stiff prison sentence, for supporting Ukraine, for donating money to Ukraine, which, from Russia's point of view, is an enemy state. But she allegedly donated $51 to Ukraine. the tiniest amount, a trifle. But it seems that even that is enough to catch the Russians' attention right now, particularly because she's a dual national, particularly because she's an American citizen. Evan Gershkovich, an American journalist, still in prison in Russia. In fact, a judge just denied one of his appeals. So it seems that Putin's regime is rounding up Americans in order to show its power, to punish the United States, punish other governments, but particularly the U.S. right now for imposing sanctions and for its harsh criticism after the very suspicious death of Alexei Navalny at a penal colony.
Richard Engel, thank you. Let's bring in now our team of reporters. Gabe Gutierrez is at the White House, and with me on set is NBC News congressional correspondent Julie Sirkin and NBC News justice reporter Ryan Riley. So, Gabe, let's start with you. What communication has the U.S. had with Russia in regards to Karlina's detention?
Well, Ryan, the White House and the Biden administration has asked for consular assistance in Russia, but that has yet to be granted. And as you just saw in Richard's report, this comes after other Americans that have been detained. For example, the American reporter Evan Gershkovich. There have been very tense negotiations regarding his release for quite some time. And now, as Richard mentioned, that the White House and the State Department today reiterating that call for all Americans, including dual nationals in Russia, to leave immediately, Ryan.
And Gabe, the White House is also working on a new package of sanctions against Russia in the wake of Navalny's death. What do we know about this package at this point?
Well, Ryan, as the president said yesterday, that's expected to be announced on Friday. Now, today, the State Department said that those sanctions are expected to be robust and that some, at least some of them, will be related directly to Alexei Navalny. Now, several administration officials have spoken to NBC News, and one of those senior administration officials says that, at least some of the sanctions may be related to the Russian oil price cap, basically how much that oil can be sold on international markets. So we expect that potentially. But again, a lot is up in the air right now until we hear on Friday. We understand that the package, sanctions package, is still being discussed, Ryan.
Gabe, obviously there have been quite a few rounds of sanctions. It hasn't really changed Russia's behavior much at all, if any. How do they believe that this will actually turn the tide and have some sort of impact on Putin or the Kremlin?
Yeah, that's certainly a huge question, Ryan. And as you said, Russia has been under sanctions since really the war in Ukraine began. But those sanctions have had little to no impact because Russia continues to be shielded by China. It's still selling oil internationally, and it's also being held by Iran and North Korea. So there were a lot of questions about how this package of sanctions might be different. Again, the State Department saying today that these sanctions will be more robust than previous ones. Fine.
And President Biden also today calling out Donald Trump for his lack of a response to Navalny's death. What did the president say?
Yeah, that's right. President Biden and his team posting on X a video where the president went on the attack against Donald Trump and basically called him out, called the former president out for not referring to Russian President Vladimir Putin when discussing Navalny. Now, as you mentioned in the Fox News town hall last night, former President Trump said it was a horrible thing happening in our country. We're turning into a communist country. And President Biden today, in that video that was just released, asked why the former president was blaming America in this instance. And he called on him, President Biden calling on the former president to call out Russian President Vladimir Putin directly. So this debate over Russia, over Vladimir Putin, certainly factoring in to the presidential campaign as we head into the heat of the 2024 election.
All right, Gabe Gutierrez on the North Lawn there for us. Gabe, thank you for that. Julie, let me turn to you now because obviously busy day on Capitol Hill with the president's brother on Capitol Hill answering questions by the impeachment inquiry committees. I mean, what do we know so far about this interview, which we should point out is still ongoing?
Yeah, it's still happening. It's been hours of this interview so far. It's happening also behind closed doors. So there's not much we can glean of it until members come out, until James Biden comes out himself. We'll see if he wants to talk to the press. You certainly tried to get him to talk coming into that interview, and he told you, Ryan, that he plans to tell the committee committee the truth. But you did also get your hands on the opening statement from James Biden. He pointed out in this statement that he has had a 50-year career, and none of it has ever touched the president, which is his brother, Joe Biden, that he had a lot of business ventures, that he separated his personal life from his professional life and never told his brother, Joe Biden, about it. So certainly the committee, Republicans especially, are going to try to make that point. They've tried to establish this link that somehow these business ventures, not only from James Biden, but also from the president's son Hunter, had anything to do with the president, that he profited on this. James Biden poking a hole in that, and we'll see what happens when it wraps up.
And of course, Jim Jordan, as he went into the hearing today, actually admitted that, a big part of what they're investigating here was that period of time after Joe Biden left the vice president's office and before he was elected president. Doesn't that in a certain way undermine the whole premise of the impeachment, that he was using his influence as a public official to benefit his son or benefit himself?
It's a great question, and it's not the first time Jim Jordan made that kind of comment. Republicans have been very clear that they're looking into Joe Biden's time as vice president, as time as senator as well, and how he profited allegedly, or didn't profit, off of his name, essentially. And so you have a case where, of course, Republicans are still moving forward with the impeachment regardless of that fact. But I do want to point out that former President Trump, in his second impeachment trial before the Senate, a big reason why Senate Republicans did not vote to convict Trump in that case is because they said that the actions that he may or may not have done on January 6th was after his time as president. You already had Senator Mark Wayne Mullen, for example, last month say that argument, that if they send this over and the House ultimately votes on this, it's going to be a really, really high bar for them to convict the president when all these actions, to your point, happened before he was president.
Right. So speaking of potentially undermining the impeachment inquiry, Ryan, we had an interesting revelation yesterday in Las Vegas courtroom. The special counsel, David Weiss, obviously pushing for an indictment of Alexander Smirnov, who's a former FBI informant. We believe he is the root of this FBI tip sheet, which Republicans are the ones that have described this. This isn't me describing it, have described it as one of the major pieces of evidence that led them to launch the impeachment inquiry. And now the special counsel is asking that they reconsider the release of Alexander Smirnov. What's the likelihood that the judge will grant this request?
Yeah, these allegations really were at the heart of this impeachment inquiry, and that's from Jim Jordan himself saying that directly. In this case, essentially, this is what happened essentially in a lot of the same January 6 cases, where someone gets arrested in one federal district and then ultimately the case is heard in a different one. So what they're doing here is saying this initial decision by the federal magistrate judge in Las Vegas, rather, should be looked at by the judge who will ultimately oversee this case when it's prosecuted in California. So basically, they're going from the federal magistrate judge to an actual federal judge here, and saying that, there's a lot of reasons that he should be held pre-trial. He's already been released, so he's had a little bit of, freedom and potential to communicate at this point already. But they say that he really needs to be held behind bars because there's a threat that he's going to continue to spread misinformation about one of the presidential candidates, i.e. Joe Biden, and that could be something that was derived from these Russian intelligence contacts that he had.
And maybe expand on that a little bit, because I think that came as a surprise to many of us. We knew, well, the indictment initially was a surprise, but then the surprise that he was actually could be working with Russian intelligence officials. Is that perhaps the biggest takeaway from this arraignment yesterday?
It was. That's what really surprised me yesterday. It was just how recently some of these contacts were, because what we knew before is this was someone who was trusted as of, middle of 2020, right? This is a long while ago, almost 4 years ago, that at that point we knew he was trusted. But what this shows is that he was recently dealing with his FBI handler and had these planned trips overseas, and was going to meet with other Russian, or I guess, foreign intelligence counterparts, and could get more information there. So he's been used very recently by the FBI, and I think that raises a lot of questions for the FBI overall about how they've been vetting a lot of the information that is coming from these sources, and why they continue to use this individual when those tips that he initially gave back in 2020 were pretty suspicious.
Yeah, and it's something that Republicans were bringing up today. But it doesn't seem, though, Julie, that despite this credibility kind of being blown out on this particular witness, that they've based a lot of the primacy of this impeachment inquiry, it doesn't appear that they're slowing down that process at all, despite Democrats saying that this should mean the end of the impeachment inquiry.
Yeah, no, they're not. And Jim Jordan basically said as much today. He said that this does not fundamentally change the course that Republicans are pursuing, the facts that they're trying to find here. And you're right, he was the star witness. He was the whistleblower that they based their entire inquiry on. But so far, Republicans Republicans are kind of finding new things to latch onto. They talked about, for example, that special counsel report that came out against the president. They're going to keep finding other ways to push this forward. And I should note, after they talk to James Biden today, they're going to hear from Hunter Biden behind closed doors next week. So certainly, despite Democrats, despite Jamie Raskin saying this blows a hole in their entire case for impeaching the president, which they said that this whole time, that they are still pursuing this, and they're going to keep doing these interviews and trying to find what sticks.
I think one of the things I was struck by, Ryan, was the timeline of all this. And it seems as though the judge is concerned about that as well. I mean, what's the source of his scrutiny in relation to discovering this alleged lying by this source and the way the prosecutors have handled it?
You know, if you go back to when this was being handled at the time, remember, at the time that they looked at this, that this tip came in, guess who was in charge of the Justice Department? The Trump administration, right? This was something that was assigned to a U.S. attorney out of Pennsylvania, Scott Brady, who was looking at this very directly. And, you know, Bill Barr had recommended that he investigate this. They looked at it, and they didn't end up really doing a deep inquiry into this. And I think that was probably the pivot point where you have to say, okay, well, if they knew this wasn't true, if they knew these were false allegations, if they couldn't verify this confidential human sources travel, why didn't that raise more suspicions going forward? Why was he still used? But, you know, big picture, I think when you're talking to average voters, one thing that sometimes just gets lost in this is that we know where Joe Biden's money came from after he was president. We know how he purchased that shore house. He's released all of his tax records, right? So it's like, if someone asks you, where'd all this money come from? Well, he had a pretty sweet book deal, right? So that all sort of, I think, is just big picture, something to remind people of, like, we know the source of this money. He got a good book deal. Jill wrote a book, too. Right.
Okay, Ryan Riley, Julie Sirkin, thank you both for being here. We appreciate it. And up next, we have two NBC exclusives as Republican candidates navigate the politics of post-Roe America. First, Nikki Haley tells NBC News that she believes embryos are babies, agreeing with the controversial ruling from Alabama's Supreme Court that frozen embryos are considered children. And we'll hear from a Republican Senate candidate on how his family's personal story has shaped his view of the issue heading into November. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Turning now to new developments tied to an issue that has Republicans, I should say, on defense and could swing elections across the country this year, just like it did in the 2022 midterms: abortion access and reproductive rights. The politically and morally complicated issue of when life begins was thrust back into the headlines this week in a big way when Alabama's Supreme Court ruled that embryos should be considered children and that there could be legal penalties for destroying them. Since the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, laws around reproductive rights and abortion have turned into a complicated patchwork. Abortion is banned or severely restricted across a wide swath of the country now, and activists on both sides of the aisle are pushing a number of ballot measures to protect or further limit abortion access at a state level in November. In Maryland and New York, amendments aimed at codifying abortion rights in their state constitutions are already set to be on the ballot. And at least 11 other states are working on getting proposed measures on the ballot this year, the majority of them brought by pro-abortion rights groups following successful campaigns in red states like Kansas and Ohio. Now, this all comes as the Republican frontrunner Donald Trump has privately signaled he might support a national 16-week ban on abortion. President Biden and Democrats have seized on the issue, putting pressure on Republicans, especially those in competitive races. NBC senior political reporter Natasha Korecki spoke to one of those Republicans, Nevada Senate candidate Sam Brown. He's an Army veteran who was severely injured while serving in Afghanistan with a deeply personal connection to the abortion issue.
Voters need to know here that I'm not in a position to, nor do I want to do anything that changes our existing law. Our existing Nevada law is also not at risk of being changed. I cannot change it. I will not change it. I respect the law that the voters put in place over 30 years ago that grants access for women up to 24 weeks. And so, no, I will not vote on a federal abortion ban.
There was one time where you said if there was any sort of legislation that would come forward, I'd want to see the specific language. It seems like you were leaving an opening there, but you're saying now.
Yeah, close the door. I'm not going to support a federal abortion ban.
Close the door. In the interview, Brown's wife, Amy, publicly shared for the first time that she had an abortion before the two met. Sam Brown spoke about learning about her experience and how that's influenced his position on the issue.
You know, my position has been, and I believe more broadly, many Republicans that I know are in favor of there being exceptions for, you know, real medical emergencies or a threat to the life of mother, rape, or incest.
So to underscore that, rape, incest, and
right.
you are, because I do think that there had been some ads already targeting you about abortion and saying that you do not support these exceptions.
Right. That's there have been misleading ads and just you know, frankly, just ads that lie about my position. I do believe that there ought to be exceptions for medical emergencies, threat to the life of a mother, rape, incest. But again, these are things that are very easy, you know, to just say and just sort of, you know, have people run through a checklist. Let's not forget that, you know, we're talking about someone's life and someone who's really in a tough spot, and that's why, you know, Amy has used her own personal experience, and I support her as her husband to share her message of what she felt like her choices were, and what her life was like before, during, and after her pregnancy.
Joining me now on set is NBC News senior national political reporter Natasha Korecki and NBC's Dasha Burns, who's covering the Republican primary and abortion politics. Natasha, obviously a fascinating interview, a compelling character who's at the center of this raging debate across the country. Tell us a little more about your interview with the Browns, and in particular about his wife Amy sharing her story and the complicated emotions that she has around it.
So complicated, Brian. She told us she felt a lot of remorse about her abortion, a lot of regret around it. And you could really see that come across in the interview. She also talked about empathy for other women who have abortions and what they're going through before and after, and having support for those women. That was something she really wanted to get across. But she did get very emotional at times. Let's take a listen.
I think when I made my choice, I was under the impression that I was choosing freedom, but I did not receive freedom. I received a 5-year sentence to living with regret and shame, and just having my life wrecked. I feel like we've boiled the pro-life movement down to legislation and policy, and I feel like it should really be so much more. It should be building awareness, increasing or building advocacy, and increasing support for women before, during, and after pregnancy. And that's really what my focus is on.
Sam is running for Senate. If you had to give a message to Nevadans, to women, on, you know, how your husband sees this issue, you know, what would you want to get across?
I would want them to know that Sam has been with me essentially from day one on the issue, and he's helped me process it with compassion and with empathy. And he understands the constraints of the law. He respects them, and he respects and understands fully what a difficult personal issue this is, because he's been with me through it all.
What a fascinating response that she has. Obviously, is still dealing with the after effects of all of this. And it's interesting, too, because I think this has been a criticism of Republican politics, is that their concern about the life of a baby or the embryo in the womb is up until birth and not after. Is that part of their message here, to trying to expand it beyond kind of challenging Republican politicians to care about the entire life cycle?
Yeah, I mean, certainly here, that's what Sam Brown and Amy Brown got across numerous times. What about the woman here? Are we forgetting about the woman? Let's be compassionate toward her. Let's offer her support. I think one point Sam said, shame on us if we don't offer women support. And certainly, there's some political realities here, of course.
Right. Let's talk about, I mean, there is politics here, right? I mean, this is a difficult position to be. Nevada's certainly a swing state. This isn't the type of state that's necessarily ruby red. He's challenging an incumbent in Jackie Rosen. Does he feel the need to tilt toward the center on this issue? Is that part of why they're sharing their story now?
Well, I mean, I think the timing is he feels safe in his primary. He's a front runner by polling and fundraising, and also, you know, now he's moving into this. He's getting attacked by Democrats, and this is going to be a big issue in Nevada. Abortion is a very popular with lots of support in Nevada. He knows that. They have a 24-week ban right now. He had to get that across that he would support that ban. And also, federal abortion bans, very unpopular, particularly in Nevada. He got that across to us numerous times. He would not support a federal abortion ban.
Okay, so Natasha, this also comes at the time that we have this ruling in Alabama related to IVF and embryos. Is this likely to be a court decision that eventually makes its way to the Supreme Court? Is this the last we've heard of this, or could there be more around this? And of course, with the reminder that the Supreme Court is a pretty conservative court right now.
Right. This isn't the last we've heard of this. It's also not necessarily just limited to Alabama. So just to remind our viewers, Alabama just ruled in a case, a wrongful death case brought by 3 couples whose embryos were destroyed. They ruled that embryos are children, and that has massive implications for couples going through IVF, for IVF and fertility clinics. Already just today, the University of Alabama at Birmingham paused IVF treatments because they're not sure where this is going to head. So it's possible this goes to the Supreme Court. It's not guaranteed that they're going to take it up, and if they don't, that is going to be the law of the land in Alabama. There are also several other states, Florida, for example, that are taking the legislative approach and bringing bills to the table that would create personhood for embryos. This is going to be a problem for Republicans because after Roe fell, this was exactly the concern of a lot of people, not just Democrats, but people were concerned that they were going to then go after contraception next, that they were going to potentially go after these sorts of fertility treatments. So for Republicans who at a lot of levels, like the gentleman you just spoke with, they're trying to moderate their message, right? While at the state level, you're starting to still see these sorts of initiatives that, you know, IVF is not a blue or red issue. This is something that hundreds of thousands of couples across the United States use every year.
Well, I have to imagine now this is going to be a question that every single candidate running on, no matter where they are on the ballot, are going to get asked about that. Nikki Haley, as an example, she's running for the highest office in the land, still in a Republican primary, and she talked about it today.
Yeah, our colleague Ali Vitale, on top of it, already asked her a question about this, her response to what happened in Alabama. Take a listen.
I mean, embryos to me are babies. So,
Even those created through IVF.
I mean, I had artificial insemination. That's how I had my son. So when you look at, you know, one thing is to have, to save sperm or to save eggs. But when you talk about an embryo, you are talking about, to me, that's a life.
So really interesting response there. Certainly, this is going to be something we'll be asking former President Trump about as well. Just about every Republican candidate is now going to have to respond to this. And we're going to have to watch over the course of this year how Republicans talk about abortion, because there is a big effort on the part of the GOP. They saw the losses in 2022. They were for so long pushing for the overturning of Roe versus Wade, but now it's become a political liability. So how they handle this going forward. I've been talking to Kellyanne Conway, who's been trying to lead the charge on this with the GOP. She's been talking about compassion and consensus on this issue. Very specific terms that I think we're going to hear a lot more.
And I would have to imagine this is going to put them in a difficult position, because you can't on the one hand say that you're in favor of or would allow a ban of 15, 24, in Brown's case it's 24 weeks, Trump is saying 16 weeks, if you're then at the same time saying that an embryo is a person, right? You would have to, if you're in agreement with the ruling, you would have to be in agreement with abortion being illegal at all stages.
Yeah,
right?
no, it's fascinating, and I think right now we're seeing a little bit of a federal versus state and local divide on this, where some of these conservative state legislatures are pushing further to the right on this issue, as you have national Republicans going, no, 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 we got to reel it back in. But for Democrats, this is an opportunity, but it's also something they have to walk a careful line on as well. There's this assumption that if you put abortion on the ballot, if you put an initiative to, for example, enshrine abortion rights in the state constitution, as we've seen in a lot of states, that means people are going to turn out and vote for Democrats down ballot as well. That's not necessarily the case. There are Republican voters and moderate voters that will come out and vote in favor of abortion rights, but might still vote for a Republican candidate over a Democrat, and that's something that Democrats.
And one of the things, Natasha, we've seen Republicans kind of message test is this idea that Democrats are in favor of abortion right up until the moment of birth. I mean, is that an effective message anywhere in the country at this point?
Right. It's a way that they're trying to push back on this. They're saying, well, you know, you're painting us in extremes. Why won't we paint you in extremes? I mean, of course, we know a lot of the facts behind that. There's very few cases of abortion passed in late-term abortions are very rare. And then we're seeing, as Natasha pointed out, case after case of these extreme measures that Democrats can easily point to. And people like Sam Brown, who are in, you know, who are going to be really significant to the Senate majority in the fall, are saying, please no.
Right.
We don't want to be tied to some of these extreme measures. They're trying to moderate at the same time that this is happening across the country.
Yeah, I mean, there is no doubt that abortion will be one of the major topics on the ballot this fall, for sure. Terrific reporting for both of you. Thank you for being here. We really appreciate it. Natasha and Dasha, you guys could be sisters. Thank you both. And you can get even more of Natasha's incredible reporting today in our NBC News Politics newsletter. Sign up for From the Politics Desk at nbcnews.com/newsletters, or just scan that QR code, which is right on your screen. Up next, President Biden's new moves on student debt relief and what it could mean for you in 2024. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. The Biden administration announcing today it will cancel student loan debt for more than 150,000 borrowers, and that the people receiving the relief will get an email from the president. It comes as President Biden, who's on a fundraising swing in California, continues to make his case for re-election while trying to shore up support from key groups that will be pivotal in November, like, for instance, young voters. Well, joining me now on our panel is Nicholas Wu, who's the congressional reporter for Politico, Stephanie Shrirock, a senior advisor for the Strategic Victory Fund, and Matt Continenti, who's the director of domestic policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute and is a columnist at Commentary Magazine. So, Nick, let's start with you. The Biden administration canceling student debt for 150,000 borrowers. I assume he's hoping they're voters. Is this going to lead to voters showing up to the polls in November? Or could it even backfire, though? Because what if you're not in that group of 150,000?
Well, I think the question for the Biden administration and his campaign is to what extent voters are going to connect this particular policy movement and, you know, wanting to vote for the president this November. There's a lot of other issues on young voters' minds and a lot of discontent we've seen in polling, whether it's about foreign policy and the war in Gaza or climate. And so, you know, we'll have to see whether or not this is the kind of thing that will sway enough young voters.
Yeah, to that point, Stephanie, I mean, canceling student loans, certainly something that young voters care about. But it seems that the energy, the passion right now with young voters is, to Nick's point, about what's happening in the Middle East. A lot of concern about what's happening in Gaza. Is this going to paper that over? Is it one stronger than the other? Or does he really need to zero in on this angst that young voters have about the situation in the Middle East?
Oh, I definitely think the president he's got a job to do to talk to younger voters. And this piece on student loans is a piece of that puzzle, right? I mean, so is abortion access, which they care about deeply. So is conservation, which he has an incredible record on. And yes, of course, in dealing with Israel and Gaza, and you can see that this is popping up on the campuses all across the country. But I also go to the campuses and find out, like, this student loan thing has been really loud recently, and folks were really disappointed that the courts turned it around, right? We had it for a brief moment, and so many of these students thought they were going to get this relief and then didn't. So
do they blame the courts or do they blame the president?
Well, this is part of our job, because we're going to have to make it clear that it was the courts that took this down. And he's been able, through administrative means, to move not just this, but $138 billion of student loan. Just think about what that means for the economy.
Yeah, right. So, Matt, let's talk about one of the issues that we talked about on our show, actually two of them, Russia and abortion. They're two different issues, deep divisions right now in the Republican Party on how to proceed. You know, how are Republicans grappling with the Russia piece and the abortion piece heading into November?
Well, I think they're divided on the questions, and you see some of the confusion coming from the different messages, especially on abortion and this news out of Alabama about the child endangerment and the IVF. But just to take a step back and go back to the student loan debate, what's interesting to me about this election so far is despite all of Biden's attempts to hand out favors to constituencies, such as the student loan forgiveness for the young voters, and despite the bettering macroeconomic picture, like our low unemployment numbers, voters aren't giving him any credit. And so what that suggests to me is that Biden's problem isn't policy, it's actually him. And I think it's very hard to correct for that in the months running up to the election.
But then getting back to abortion, though, and particularly this IVF issue, the embryo protections, I mean, if you're a Republican candidate and you don't even live in Alabama, how do you grapple with this issue? You're certainly going to be asked about it, right?
You are, and you're going to have an answer, and we saw the answer from someone like Nikki Haley earlier on your program. You're going to have to be ready to defend that answer. You're going to have to be ready to talk specifics. And you're probably going to have to be in a position similar to Trump's position, which is you say, we should have some type of restriction on abortion, but there should always be exceptions, right? And so in some ways, he's actually toward the center of the electorate, unlike the Alabama State Supreme Court. So I'd expect most Republicans to follow Trump's lead, not the state Supreme Court's lead.
Okay, so Democrats, are they talking about abortion enough, Stephanie, from your perspective? Can they talk about it enough, especially given rulings like this one?
I mean, this Alabama ruling is terrifying. Set abortion aside, for all of reproductive freedom in this country. I mean, my goodness, all of us have friends and family or are part of a family that has had IVF. I mean, this is incredibly dangerous. And so the Republicans just continue to just mishandle this issue. And no, Trump might be where he says where he is today, but he also very proudly stands by the court he put together, which took down Roe v. Wade and took this freedom away from American women and their families. So this issue is going to be a huge one. And at the end of the day, when this election is about choices, it's not necessarily a Trump versus Biden. It's going to be about access to abortion, what's happened with climate. These are going to be the issues that are going to be motivating voters across the country.
So, Nick, we heard Nevada Senate candidate Sam Brown in our last segment talking that if he gets elected, he's a no on any sort of federal abortion ban, which would be significant if he were to flip that seat. But we do have some members who are in favor of that. Lindsey Graham continues to propose a 15-week ban. Is there really any momentum behind this idea of a federal ban on Capitol Hill besides, certain members just kind of messaging it to their core constituents?
As long as the legislative filibuster remains in place, it is going to be impossible to get any kind of nationwide abortion ban through. Folks like Lindsey Graham have talked about this for years. It hasn't really gotten anywhere. And so I think what we're hearing from folks like that Nevada Senate candidate will really be a test of Republican strategy of trying to let candidates go their own way in these crucial races. At the same time, Democrats will be faced with the challenge of trying to tie these candidates to these nationwide Republican proposals.
Right. So even if he says that he's in favor or he's not in favor of a national ban, there's probably still going to be ads accusing him of that, right?
We can expect to see a lot of that on the campaign trail.
Right. Yeah. So, Matt, let's go back and talk to about what we talked about at the top of our program, this kind of overarching threat from Russia on multiple threats. You have the issue with Donald Trump comparing himself to Alexei Navalny last night over his legal woes. Do you think there comes a time where Donald Trump is penalized by voters because of his appeasement for Putin and Russia? Could that backfire for him, particularly in a general election?
Well, I'm not so sure voters vote on foreign policy. And in truth, the idea that Ukraine is turning into kind of a standstill, a war of attrition, that it isn't just Republicans, it's many independents as well. So I think when you talk about Trump's liabilities in this election, it's more of his association with extremism. It's more of the sense that chaos follows him, as Nikki Haley always says. It's those sort of things that I think will give independent voters pause in November. But we have to say, as we sit here today, Donald Trump is winning this election. He's winning independent voters. And I think the reason is memories are short and people are concentrating on the incumbent rather than his predecessor of 4 years ago.
What do you think of that, Stephanie?
I think that's why we have campaigns. And when we live in I dare to say, sitting here on Meet the Press, in a really large media environment that is driven very much by right-wing media, they campaign through their media systems 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, which is to my great frustration, but was really smart. We start campaigning now, and you're going to start seeing the flood of ads go up, the flood of volunteers hitting the doors, and this is going to be fought out in the campaign season, and it is just getting started. And these two folks are going to be very defined by each other, and we'll see where the voters land at the end of the day.
All right, great conversation, guys. Thank you all for being here. Nick, Matt, and Stephanie, we appreciate it so much. Next, a decade-long extradition saga facing Wikileaks founder Julian Assange could finally be coming to an end as a British High Court hears the case to send him to the U.S., where he faces up to 175 years in prison on espionage charges. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Following 2 days of hearings, judges at the High Court in London today announced that they won't make a decision on Julian Assange's extradition to the United States until March at the earliest. Protesters, including Assange's wife, lined the street outside the court on both days of the hearing. NBC News international correspondent Josh Lederman has the story from London.
After 2 days of hearings here at the Royal Courts of Justice in London, the only thing standing between Julian Assange and extradition to the U.S. is a decision from the judges. Now, the two judges in this case could have issued a ruling from the bench just as soon as the hearing wrapped up, but instead, they said that they are going to wait. They are going to review all of the evidence, including potentially new submissions by writing to the court that can take place up until March 4th. And at that point, they will issue a ruling. And so at this point, no final decision is expected until March 4th at the very earliest. But if the judges deny Julian Assange a full appeal, it could be a matter of weeks or even just days before he is put on a U.S. plane with marshals and brought back to the U.S. to face a trial on espionage and other charges. And today in court, the U.S. made the argument that the legal team from Assange is distorting this case by claiming that he is being persecuted and prosecuted for mere journalism. They say that the U.S. case against Assange is going to focus on the computer hacking and the computer intrusion, arguing that he conspired with former Army intelligence officer Chelsea Manning to actually hack into government computers using passwords that they were not theirs, stealing information that they were not supposed to have access to, and then dumping it on the internet in unredacted ways that put the lives of Americans at risk. It will be up to the judges to decide whether they feel the U.S. has made its case or whether human rights concerns may intervene and grant a full appeal to Julian Assange.
All right, Josh Lederman, thank you for that report. Next, the top Democrat on the House Foreign Affairs Committee will join me to talk the foreign and domestic threats facing President Biden and Congress. You're watching Meet the Press Now. And welcome back. As we reported earlier, the White House is working on a new sanctions package against Russia in the wake of Alexei Navalny's death. And while Navalny's death has received bipartisan condemnation from lawmakers on Capitol Hill, that condemnation may not translate to action. There remains no consensus on approving additional aid for Ukraine in its fight against Russia. And joining me now is the Democrat from New York and, of course, the ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Congressman Gregory Meeks. Congressman, thank you so much for being here. We have so much to talk about. Let's start with Russia and how it looms over our domestic politics. We have the war in Ukraine and now this new Russia connection to the FBI informant who was a key aspect of the Biden impeachment inquiry. Do you right now view Russia as the greatest threat to the U.S. and our interests?
Russia is a huge threat. You know, we've got a number of threats, unfortunately. Russia's a huge threat, one of the greatest threats, but, you know, we've got to watch out for, you got North Korea, you got China, you got various folks, but Russia is one of those head leaders, and what they're doing in Europe against Ukraine and the threat that they present is a big threat. And we know of their tampering into elections, both in the United States and other places. Those are problems. And so we've got to make sure that we stand up strong. That's why passing the supplemental is tremendously important, and we've got to do it next week.
You know, the White House is working on a sanctions package to hold Russia accountable for Navalny's death. I know that you spoke to his widow. What did she tell you, and what do you think should be in this sanctions package?
Well, number one, I got to tell you how brave a woman that she is. to be there at the time that the death of her husband was announced, to state that she was and made a statement publicly at that particular time, and saying she would continue the work of her husband, that she will not let his living be in vain, to have met with me and other members of the congressional delegation, saying that her focus will be on the foundation and the focus will be on making sure that there's democracy in Russia, and that the criminal activities of Vladimir Putin is exposed, and that she wanted her concerned about making sure she gets her husband's body back. So she is a brave, focused woman who understands and will not allow the sacrifices that her husband made, sacrificed his life for a better democratic society in Russia, will not go in vain, and she will pick up his work.
Now, but to the sanctions, though, sir, there have already been a long line of sanctions that have been imposed upon Russia. It hasn't really seemed to change the course of the war or their activity in that region. What can be done in terms of sanctions to actually get them to start changing course and doing things differently?
There will be additional sanctions that will, of course, be devastating to the economy of Russia. Also warning those that are dealing with parts and other things that goes to help them continue the war. So there will be other sanctions that will be going and extended to other countries. But the most important thing that we can do to deter Russia is pass the supplemental. Give the Ukrainians what they need so that they can fight Russia and its aggression. And that's the most important thing that we need to do, and we need to do it immediately. I think that if we give them what they need, they will have the ability to beat back and stop Russia from continuing its assault.
All right, well, let's talk about your strategy there. I know that you were in Munich with Leader Jeffries. I know that he and you both heard several countries really press on you to get this Ukraine aid bill over the finish line. What is the minority leader's plan to get this over the finish line? Are you looking at a discharge petition? Are you talking to moderate Republicans about finding a way to partner up to get this legislation on the floor? I mean, what can be done to at least get a vote on this particular measure?
Well, first, let me just say all options are on the table. And there's several different options, some of which I'm not going to even talk about, but all options on our side are on the table. But what Leader Jeffries has been saying and ready and willing to do is to meet and to talk with our Republican allies so that we can get something done. It's clear that the Senate has passed a bipartisan bill that we should be able to vote on. And there are a number of Republicans, those that were on the trip with us, who have said that we will get it done. So one of the quickest ways to get it done is to join with Democrats to sign a motion of discharge so that we can go around the speaker. The first thing they should do is to be able to talk to their leadership and get Johnson to do it. I mean, that would be the first thing and the easiest thing to do. Get their leadership. They believe there's enough numbers there because if the vote comes on the floor, you get 300 votes. If Johnson refuses to do it because of him talking, we saw Johnson talking to Donald Trump, and Donald Trump does not want him to do it, then work with Democrats to go around the speaker to get it on the floor. And that simply means, for most folks never heard of a motion to discharge, if you have sufficient numbers, 218 people to sign on a motion to discharge, then the vote can go on the floor without the consent of the speaker.
Right.
So we should have that. There's a number of colleagues that I know that say that they are for Ukraine. Here is the time for them on the Republican side to really step up and step up quickly. And if you could either convince the speaker to put it on the floor or work with us and sign up a motion to discharge so that we can get this bill on the floor immediately.
All right, let's turn to the campaign trail now, sir. And I want to talk about your colleague, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib. She's urging Democrats in Michigan to vote against President Biden in the primary. It's in response. She wants to send a message to the White House about the way they're prosecuting the war with Israel against Gaza. What's your response to the Congresswoman?
She's flat out wrong. She's just absolutely flat out wrong. When you know what's going on and the confidence that you have and she should have and we all should have in President Biden, and knowing the hard job that he is currently doing, to try to make a fundamental difference in the Middle East. And the alternative to that, an individual who was the first to come with a Muslim ban, and we know what he stands and what he represents to this country, to discourage people to come out to vote is something that is flat out wrong. I would never, ever. Too many people died for the right to vote. So to sit out voting is something that I would never recommend.
All right, Congressman Meeks, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it. We'll see you back here in Washington next week. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And I'll be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. But in the meantime, sign up for NBC News' new political newsletter from the political desk. Go to NBCnews.com/newsletters or scan the QR code on your screen right now. And I should point out that Kristen will actually be back here tomorrow. It won't be me. So that's good news for you, probably in the aggregate. NBC News Now coverage continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.